This is Guy Ross, and this is the 3rd day of March, 1967, and I'm in the office today of Mr. Murray Gibbons, the Assistant District Attorney from McLean County. When we were talking the other day, you started talking about your father and what he did and so forth, so why don't we just start there?
My father, James E. Gibbons, was a saddle and harness maker. He had a shop in Purcell, having come to Purcell in 1889. My recollection as a boy is observing him at work, and I delighted in playing around the shop. One of the interesting features of retail business at Purcell at that time was the fact that Indians living west of Purcell would come to Purcell to trade and would ordinarily camp at a place on Walnut Creek about 5 miles west of Purcell. There was very little area in cultivation at that time, principally grassland, raising being the principal industry in and around Purcell at that time. This was before the Rock Island Railway had been constructed west of Purcell, and Purcell was the railhead for points west. Most of the shipments or goods were transported from the Santa Fe depot in Purcell by means of wagons, oxen being the principal means of hauling these wagons. I can recall seeing these wagons on the streets in Purcell, anywhere from 2 to 4 yoke of oxen. One characteristic of the Indian trade was the fact that they never purchased but one item at a time. They would indicate the item they wanted, ascertain the price, and if agreeable, they would pay the price, take the item, and continue with their shopping.
You talked the other day about your father was the chairman of the Democratic Party in this county.
At this time and prior to statehood, lands in the Chickasaw Nation were held in common. This condition was continued until the Toka Agreement of 1906 was put into force and effect. The beginning of election of delegates to the Constitutional Convention was based upon federal recording districts in the Indian Territory side of the state. Purcell was in the 18th Federal Recording District. The Democrats nominated Charles McLean as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, and the Republicans nominated a lawyer here in Purcell, J.W. Hocker, as the Republican candidate. Hocker had occasion to address a political rally at the town of Byers, which at that time prohibited Negroes from being in the town of Byers after sundown. Hocker was making his campaign from point to point using a buggy and team as means of transportation, and had a Negro boy named Ollie Hudson who was driving the team for him. After they had finished the speaking at Byers and started back to Purcell, someone fired upon them from ambush and wounded Hudson, the driver. My father, who was at that time chairman of the Democratic Central Committee, received this information along about midnight and immediately proceeded to go to the residence of the editor and publisher of the Purcell Register, a party named Walker, and got Mr. Walker to come down and open up his print shop, set up and print a number of handbills offering a reward for the apprehension and conviction of the person or persons who had fired upon Hocker and his driver. These handbills were distributed over Purcell and other points in McLean County the first thing on the morning subsequent to the incident. This served to deprive the Republicans from making too much of an issue of the attempted firing upon Hocker and his driver. And when the election was finally held, Charlie McLean was elected as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention by an overwhelming vote.
Talking about the Constitutional Convention, I wish you'd talk about your having witnessed the Constitutional Convention and all that.
While the Constitutional Convention was in session, I was attending school in Lexington, Missouri. I came home for the Christmas holidays, and my father, appreciating the historical significance of the convention, went with, when I started to return to Lexington, went with me as far as Guthrie, and we got off the train at Guthrie in an effort to attend the Constitutional Convention while in session. This was on Saturday, and the convention itself was not in session on that particular date, but a Democratic caucus had been called to determine upon a question of incorporating the initiative and referendum as a part of the Constitution. Apparently, a great majority of the delegates were in favor of incorporating the initiative and referendum in the Constitution. The only point of disagreement being the percentage of votes required on a petition to initiate or a petition to refer. After considerable discussion, it was decided to adhere strictly to the Oregon Plan, so-called. It being so designated by reason of the fact that Oregon was the only state that had the initiative in the referendum in effect.
You mentioned earlier that there was some disagreement and so forth after it had already been decided.
After the vote was taken and prevailed to incorporate the so-called Oregon Plan, some of the more conservative members of the caucus were still inclined to argue about the matter. A Mr. Carnegie, who was a member from Benita, Oklahoma, was one of those who had objected to the plan. After the decision had been reached, Mr. Carnegie took the floor and stated that he thought perhaps they had been premature and that more consideration should be given the matter. Mr. Graham, who was from Marietta, Oklahoma, and a member of the Constitutional Convention, asked Mr. Carnegie to yield to a question to which Carnegie agreed, whereupon Graham said, I say to you, my brother, in the words of the lowly Nazarene, why kickest thou against the pricks? This brought about a titter of amusement, and Carnegie very quickly replied by saying, I inquired the gentleman from Marietta if he is one of the pricks. Graham shot back at him, saying, I may be, but I am not a cut one. William H. Murray was presiding over the caucus, and upon Graham's reply, he was greatly amused and threw himself backwards in his chair with such force that the chair overturned completely.
Was this typical of his actions?
I don't know about that.
I'd like to drop back for a second before we go on and get you to elaborate a little bit more about the, you say the land was held in common before the Atoka Agreement?
Yes.
Did this, was this conducive to a lot of fighting over the land?
No. The only controversy that came up was the fact that residence in the Chickasaw Nation was prohibited to all persons who were not members of the Chickasaw tribe, either by blood or marriage. A white person who had married a Chickasaw was entitled to reside in the Chickasaw Nation just the same as those who were Chickasaws by blood. This brought about considerable friction on the part of persons who were not citizens of the Chickasaw Nation attempting to reside in the nation. Finally, after the Atoka Agreement was put into effect, of course, this question was eliminated. The original plan for the distribution of lands owned by the Chickasaw Nation was that they would be distributed on a per capita basis. That is, divided up among the various citizens of the Chickasaw Nation. But in 1906, a supplemental agreement was entered into by and between the Dawes Commission and the representatives of the Chickasaw Nation, to the effect that each person should receive 320 acres of average allotable land, and that the remainder would be sold and the proceeds from the sale entrusted to the Chickasaw governing powers. This amendment to the original Topa Agreement prevailed and submitted to a vote of the Chickasaw Nation as a whole. And that was the final method of distributing the lands held by the Chickasaw Nation.
Was Purcell much of a town before the Topa Agreement?
Purcell at the time of the Topa Agreement was, in all probability, the largest town north of Gainesville, Texas, and south of Arkansas City. Many persons were of the opinion that Purcell would be the largest town in the area after the run of '89. However, it was soon overshadowed by the settlement and growth of Oklahoma City.
When the Atoka Agreement came into effect in 1906, this meant that land was distributed to the white men?
No, this land was distributed to citizens of the Chickasaw Nation, whether they were citizens by blood or by marriage.
In 1906?
In 1906 and subsequent years, yes.
Well, when were white men allowed in the Chickasaw Nation?
As a matter of fact, so far as I know, there was never any official action on the part of the Chickasaw government allowing white persons or persons who were not citizens of the Chickasaw Nation to settle in the Chickasaw Nation. And it was not until after the lands were allocated by reason of the Atoka Agreement that the restrictions against non-citizens residing in the Chickasaw Nation was done away with.
Was there a high percentage of white people in Purcell, or what it said?
Yes, there was a large percentage of white people in Purcell. That is, I use the term white people as indicating non-citizens of the Chickasaw Nation. They were here illegally, insofar as the government of the Chickasaw Nation was concerned, but there was no means provided for their being forced to leave the
No way to get them
Chickasaw
out.
Nation.
Just as long as they weren't able to own any land or anything, but
Yes.
they were here. None of them owned any land in town either, I suppose.
No, not with the legal title. The only rights anyone had was squatter rights. After the Atoka Agreement went into effect, the town of Purcell, along with the other settlements in the Chickasaw Nation, were surveyed and divided into lots and lots, and the Dawes Commission proceeded to sell these lots to the individuals who desired to purchase them, preference rights being given to those who were in possession by squatter rights.
That's what I was going to ask you next. If they were there, they had first choice.
Yeah, that's right.
Purcell was on the Chisholm Trail, was it not?
No, Purcell was east of the Chisholm Trail.
Oh, didn't the cattle drive sometime come just about right through Purcell?
That is true, just west of Purcell. But that was not a part of the Chisholm Trail drive, and after the completion of the Santa Fe, most cattle were from Texas were loaded either at Gainesville or what is now the town of Marietta, and shipped north by rail.
Another thing that occurs to me is the river down here, and I've heard stories about people fording the river between Purcell and Lexington over here, and I wonder if you have any remembrances of that river when it had to be forded.
Before the erection of a wooden bridge across the Canadian River between Purcell and Lexington, the only means of crossing was by fording. This was sometimes a dangerous operation due to quicksand forming in the river, and due to what we termed head rises in the Canadian River. That is, when the river would rise by reason of waterfall back at the source of the South Canadian River.
People get caught in those head rises occasionally?
People would get caught in those head rises, and it was no unusual occurrence for persons going from Purcell to Lexington, or vice versa, to be caught on the wrong side of the river on one of these head rises.
They just have to stay over there.
And would have to remain either in Purcell or Lexington until such time as the river subsided.
Did somebody operate a ferry down there, or was it?
No, I don't recall there ever being a ferry on the Canadian River.
It's just up to everybody to get across for himself.
That's correct.
Well, you grew up in Purcell and then went to the Army before the war, didn't you?
No, I grew up in Purcell and continued to live in Purcell until 1909, when I enlisted in the United States Navy, and for a term of 4 years served in the Navy from 1909 until November of 1913, when I was honorably discharged.
I wish you'd tell us about being in Paris when the news came of the difficulty in China.
That came later on. In 1917, when we declared war against Germany, I, in common with a great many other young men, volunteered as students in what was then known as officers' training camps that had been set up under the authority of the War Department. The original Oklahoma members or volunteers for this officers' training camp were initially ordered to Leon Springs, Texas. However, it soon developed that there were more persons than could be taken care of at Leon Springs, inasmuch as it served the state of Texas, the state of Oklahoma, and portions of the state of Louisiana and Arkansas. So just prior to the time we were supposed to report to Leon Springs, we received a telegraphic change of orders directing us to report to Fort Logan H. Roost, Little Rock, Arkansas. At the completion of the training, and in August of 1917, I was commissioned captain of the infantry in the Reserve Corps and placed on active duty. When the 87th Division was organized at Camp Pike, Arkansas, I was assigned to the 87th for duty, and we left the United States for France in August of 1918. I had occasion to be in Paris, France on November 10th, 1918, and was attending a performance at the Folies-Bergère Theater when word was received that the Kaiser had abdicated, which of course indicated the end of the war.
You, during the period you were in the, I guess it was during the period you were in the Navy that you told me you were on what you called a gunboat or something in China.
The details of my Navy experience may be summarized as follows. I was assigned to the Naval Training Station on Yerba Buena Island, San Francisco, California, for my boot camp training. In August of 1910, I was ordered out to the Asiatic Station, making passage on the USS Buffalo, a naval transport. Upon arrival at Cavite, I was assigned to duty with the USS Elcano. The Elcano was an old vessel that had been captured by Dewey at the Battle of Manila Bay, and had been converted into use for the United States Navy. We were assigned to the Yangtze River Patrol and left Cavite on sometime during the month of December to go to Hong Kong, and from Hong Kong to Shanghai, and then from Shanghai take up station on the Yangtze River. We were caught in a tremendous typhoon, and the steering gear of the Elcano carried away, as well as the wireless communication, and we were compelled to return to Cavite for repairs. Then, upon the completion of these repairs, we again started for Shanghai this time by way of Amoy, China. We arrived at Shanghai without incident, and immediately took up position as a part of the Yangtze River Patrol. At that time, there was 3 treaty ports on the Yangtze River: Nankin, China; Kukiang, China, and Hankow, China. All of the remaining towns on the river being what was termed as non-treaty ports. We would be on the river and away from Shanghai anywhere from 1 to 3 months, and then would come back down to Shanghai to refit and matters of that sort. We were in Hankow, China, lying at anchor when the Chinese Revolution broke out. It had its inception at Hanyang, which is a town just across the river from Hankow, China. Upon the completion of 18 months service on the Yangtze River Patrol, I was ordered transferred to the first submarine flotilla, then stationed at Cavite. It consisted of 4 vessels.
So were these the first submarines that were
These were the first submarines that had been placed in commission and in active service by the Navy Department.
Did you have any anxiety about them?
They were small vessels, vessels of about 10 tons displacement, and carried a crew of 10 men. No, we never had any particular anxiety or fear by reason of submerged activities. I remained on duty with the flotilla until October of 1913, when I was ordered back to the United States to be discharged upon the completion of my enlistment.
So you got out just in time to get back in from the Navy to the...
I got out in November of 1913, and in 1917 I went back into service, this time with the Army.
I'd like to ask you one more question about the river patrol before we pass on. What did you do? Just go up and down the rivers?
The river, Yangtze River Patrol was solely for the purpose of what we called showing the flag. That is to impress the various inhabitants that the United States was present and was in a position to protect the rights of its nationals, and in case of necessity would protect the rights of American citizens.
Well, then after you got out of the Army, then you began your political career began then.
Mr. Gibbons.
I was released from active duty in September of 1919 and returned to Purcell. In 1920, I filed as a candidate on the Democratic ticket and in the primary for a seat in the House of Representatives. I was successful in obtaining the nomination in the primary and was successful in being elected in the general election in November. When the legislature convened in January of 1921, the Republicans were in control of the House, and George Swaby was elected Speaker. The Speaker saw fit to create a committee on soldier relief legislation and named Victor Locke of Pushmataha County as chairman of this committee. I was placed on the committee, and Locke appointed me as vice chairman, despite the fact that I was a member of the minority party. At that time, there were no hospital facilities in the state of Oklahoma for benefit of ex-servicemen. And veterans who were in need of hospitalization were sent either to Texas or New Mexico. These men were reluctant to be so far from home, and as a result, many of them refused to accept hospitalization or refused to remain in the hospital after they had been admitted. Period. We introduced a bill appropriating $750,000 for the construction of a hospital and $250,000 for the construction of a tubercular sanitarium to be situated at Sulphur, Oklahoma. $100,000 to furnish and equip a ward in the University Hospital for emergency cases. When this bill came up for final roll call, it was defeated. The Republican leadership was opposed to the bill on the general grounds that it was not necessary and that the construction of it would be a source of graft and matters of that sort. This legislature adjourned without passing appropriation bills for either the departments of government or for any other function of government. As a result, Governor Robertson called the legislature back into session and specified but two subjects for them to legislate upon. First, general appropriations, and second, the question of soldier relief legislation. Victor Locke was so incensed at the action of the House in defeating this bill that he refused to attend upon the extraordinary or special session. Speaker Swaby, for reasons best known to himself, saw fit to appoint me as chairman of the Committee on Soldier Relief Legislation. Everybody agreed or admitted the necessity for such legislation, but differed in details. The original bill contemplated that the General Hospital would be constructed in conjunction with the University Hospital in Oklahoma City. As a matter of compromise, we finally agreed to appoint a special commission to be known as the Soldier Relief Commission. Said commission to consist of 3 members, 1 member to be selected by the State Senate, 1 member to be selected by the State House of Representatives, and 1 member to be appointed by the governor from a list of names furnished him by the American Legion. This compromise was sufficient to bring about a sufficient number of votes to pass the bill. And Governor Robertson approved it. The life of the commission must be for a period of 2 years, merely long enough to supervise the construction of the hospital facilities. The Senate selected Horace B. Hagan of Tulsa, Oklahoma, as a member of the commission. The House selected a man named Grant Victor from somewhere in the northeast part of the state. And the governor appointed H.B. Fell of Ardmore, then commander of the American Legion in the Department of Oklahoma. This commission decided to locate the General Hospital in Muskogee, Oklahoma. And the hospital accordingly was erected in Muskogee. Tubercular sanitarium erected at Sulphur. And the special emergency ward equipped at the University Hospital. When the ninth session convened in 1923, it was made to appear that the hospital at Muskogee had been completed, and that the commission was negotiating a sale of the same to the United States government, and that for that reason it would be advisable to extend the life of the commission for a period of 2 years. This was done, and each succeeding session of the legislature has seen fit to continue the Soldier Relief Commission in operation. Perhaps one of the most noteworthy things that occurred in the regular session of the legislature was the attempted impeachment of Governor Robertson. The committee reported out an impeachment bill, and when it came up for final consideration on the floor of the House, it was quite apparent that the vote would be extremely close. Not all of the Republicans were in accord with the impeachment proceedings. A representative from Oklahoma County by the name of Jerkins was living in the Capitol Hill district and was ill and not in attendance upon the House on the particular date this impeachment bill came up for consideration. They sent an ambulance to bring him up to the Capitol, and en route from his home to the Capitol building, the ambulance was involved in a collision with another vehicle, and Jerkins received injuries about the head and face. They proceeded to administer first aid and came onto the Capitol, brought him up to the 4th floor in a stretcher and to the House chamber. The roll call was in progress at the time he arrived. He entered the House chamber with his head bandaged up and blood stains showing through the bandages. He voted no, and this was the tie. This was the deciding vote, inasmuch as his vote made it a tie, an equal number for impeachment and an equal number against impeachment. And of course, it being a tie, the impeachment bill failed of passage.
Did they know how he'd vote before he got there?
Yes.
Why did they try to impeach the governor?
I don't know what the reason was for the Republican organization of the House to be so committed to impeaching J.B.A. Robertson. Of course, the principal question was concerning the administration of fiscal affairs by Dennis Day, then State Bank Commissioner, and the administration of the Bank Guarantee Fund. It being apparent that the Bank Guarantee Fund was bankrupt, a number of state banks had failed, and there was no method whereby the depositors in the failed banks could obtain reimbursement for their loss.
I bet the governor was sure glad to see him around on the scene. How long was it later then that you were elected, that you were named Speaker of the House?
I was reelected to the House in 1921, this being the ninth session which convened in 1923, being the first session under the Walton administration. And I was elected Speaker of the House at that time. The regular session of the ninth legislature was apparently uneventful. The one big item that I can recall was the passage of an amended workmen's compensation law. Prior to this mandatory act, injured workmen had to show a loss in earning capacity in order to be compensated for their injury. And this was changed by a legislative enactment during the regular session of the legislature, whereby specific awards were made for specific injuries.
To be philosophical on that, what comments do you have about the role of the Speaker of the House in that hot spot?
The position of Speaker of the House of Representatives is a position of great responsibility.
Back where we left off, I asked you if you'd philosophize on the role of the Speaker of the House.
The position of Speaker of the House is, of course, of great importance in state affairs. And while it gives the holder thereof a certain amount of honor, it nevertheless is one of great responsibility, and the Speaker of necessity becomes involved in controversial matters. His decision on these matters is oftentimes final insofar as the House is concerned, and invariably subjects the Speaker to criticism and censure, which may or may not be deserved.
Did you enjoy being Speaker of the House?
I can't say that I particularly enjoyed being Speaker of the House. I did have a great deal of gratification in being entrusted with this position.
Did you have, is it a difficult situation for the Speaker of the House in his relationship with the Governor and with the Leader of the Senate? Or do you have to...
Insofar as I was personally concerned, I had no difficulty either with my administration, my relationship with the governor or with the leadership in the Senate. Ed Trapp was was Lieutenant Governor and President Pro Tem of the Senate during this time, and he and I had no difficulty whatsoever in getting along.
After this session, I guess it was then that you moved to Oklahoma City?
I removed from Purcell to Oklahoma City in 1925. The Veterans Administration had established a regional office in Oklahoma City and had appointed Harry B. Gilstrap as manager. Gilstrap offered me a position with the Veterans Administration in the legal department, which I accepted. I moved to Oklahoma City in 1925 and continued my relationship with the Veterans Administration until 1927, when I resigned to enter the private practice of law in Oklahoma City.
You then were elected to the House then from Oklahoma County.
Yes, and when did Marlin become governor? In the campaign wherein E.W. Marlin was nominated for governor, I was a candidate for membership in the House from what was then known as the 7th District of Oklahoma County, and was nominated and elected. The organization of the House was perfected when the legislature convened by the election of Leon C. Phillips as Speaker. Phillips named me as chairman of the Committee on Roads and Highways. I was very much interested in obtaining a repeal of the legislation enacted during the administration of Governor W.H. Murray, whereby revenue from the gasoline tax was diverted from highway construction to paying off deficits in the general revenue fund. Randall Cobb, who was at that time First Assistant Attorney General, and I, working together, drew up a bill providing for the funding of this indebtedness. And this bill was finally passed in both the House and Senate without any material amendment, which served to release funds to the Department of Highways for highway construction in the state. Also during this session, I introduced a bill for the creation of the State Highway Patrol and the enactment of driver's license in the state. These two bills were defeated. In the succeeding session, I was again elected from Oklahoma County and reintroduced this legislation with the approval of Governor Marlin. Everyone seemed to be in favor of the highway patrol at this time, but no one was in favor of enactment of the driver's license law by reason of the fees attached to it. There were a number of co-authors on the bill in the House, creating a state highway patrol, and we had little or no difficulty in securing its passage. However, House Bill number 7, which provided for a system of driver's licenses and fees to be paid therefor, I was the sole author of that bill, and it was with extreme difficulty and after numerous concessions that we were able to secure a majority vote in the House. Senator Purcell from Logan County was sponsoring similar legislation in the Senate, and we finally got the legislation whipped into shape to where it commanded a majority vote in both houses and was signed by the governor and became law. Governor Marlin appointed H.B. Bud Gentry as the first Commissioner of Public Safety. I knew Gentry quite well. Had been in school with him, as a matter of fact, at the university. And after the setup was perfected, I went to him and told him that I would like to have driver's license number 7, inasmuch as that was the number of the bill which created the law establishing a driver license system. Gentry very graciously acceded to my request, and I still carry a driver's license number 7.
Was there no law enforcement at all on the highways before the highway patrol was?
Except as enforced by local officers, both the municipal and county. One of the principal objections to the enactment of the highway patrol bill was from some of the smaller counties wherein the sheriffs feared that the highway patrol would take over the duties of the sheriff's office. This proved to be unfounded, and from the time of its inception, the highway patrol and local enforcement officials, both county and municipal, have worked together very closely in the enforcement of the traffic laws of this state.
One thing that catches my attention is that you were here in McLean County, were elected from McLean County, and Speaker of the House, and then left the county, moved to another county, new constituency. I don't see how, it looks like it'd be very difficult changing constituencies like that for you then to pick up, be elected there, and how'd you go about doing that?
Well, that's a rather difficult question to answer. Campaigning for public office is to be like making love to a woman. Every man has to do it in his own way. I had formed acquaintances and associations during the time that I'd been living in Oklahoma County. I knew a number of people whom I had come in contact with during my previous service in the legislature. But I'm inclined to believe that the principal source of my strength was due to my connection with the enactment of soldier relief legislation back in 1921.
Well, you, after being elected from Oklahoma County, then you rose to become floor leader.
I was re-elected to the House from Oklahoma County for a third term. This was the first session of the legislature under Governor Leon C. Phillips. Don Welch of Marshall County was elected Speaker, and I was selected as floor leader This being agreed upon both by Mr. Welch and the governor. From my own personal viewpoint, the important piece of legislation passed during that particular session was the reorganization of the State Industrial Commission. Prior to that time, the commission consisted of 3 members and some 4 or 5 inspectors, which made a very awkward situation in trying and obtaining adjudication of workers' compensation cases. I introduced a bill providing for a commission of 5 members and doing away with the inspectors' jobs, with one exception. And this was rather bitterly contested particularly in the Senate, but eventually we secured approval of it. Perhaps the most important legislation which came before this session was the submission of a constitutional amendment prohibiting the creation of deficits in state governmental affairs. This was submitted to the people by the legislature and carried. So today it is impossible for the state of Oklahoma to go into debt in its operation of governmental affairs. I consider it one of the outstanding achievements, if not the outstanding achievement, of the Phillips administration.
You mentioned a while ago, talked about the difficulties of getting the driver's license bill through, the concessions you had to make. It reminded me of President Kennedy's statement in his book Profiles in Courage, when he said that politics is the art of compromise. Would you agree with that?
Undoubtedly. All legislation is the result of a series of compromises.
Then it would follow, I suppose, that it takes a particular kind of man to be a successful legislator.
To be a successful, this is my personal opinion, to be a successful member of any legislative body, a person or the person concerned must be willing to give and take. This is not to say that he should abandon any fundamental ideas that he may have in order to secure the enactment of legislation. There are certain things that a man can do conscientiously in an effort to compromise and adjust differences. But eventually you reach the point where some fundamental principle or issue is involved that you cannot afford to compromise. And in that event, it's better to go down in defeat than it is to sacrifice your fundamental judgment in the matter.
That's a very interesting observation. So the key then is that man has to be willing to compromise and know how to compromise in the areas that he can compromise.
I think perhaps it is best summed up in a poetic quotation, this above all, to thine own self be true, and it follows as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man.
I want to ask you about one other thing. You mentioned last Monday about you're trying to bring about a better rapport or something with the Phillips administration and the national administration, and this gave rise to some interesting anecdotes about meeting with the vice president and so forth. How would you talk about that a little bit?
I was a very close personal friend of Leon Phillips in the time that he was Speaker of the House on. I did not always agree with him and his political philosophies. Particularly, I was disturbed by the attitude that Governor-elect Phillips had towards the national administration. Phillips came down to Leon Springs in 1937 or 38, the year that he was the Democratic nominee for governor. To be present during a portion of the time while the National Guard was in camp. I took advantage of this opportunity to bring Phillips into contact with then Vice President Garner, hoping that it might serve to soften the attitude that Phillips had towards the national administration.
Were you acquainted with Garner before that time?
I had merely met Mr. Garner before that time. I arranged for the interview between Phillips and Mr. Garner through a mutual friend of myself and the Vice President, whose name I do not feel at liberty to disclose. Be that as it may, the interview was arranged for, and Mr. Phillips and I left San Antonio, Texas, to drive down to Uvalde. On arrival at Uvalde, we went to the home of the Vice President and was met at the door by a Negro servant who told us that Mr. Garner was out supervising some activities there on his ranch and would be in just a few minutes. Asked us to come in and have a seat. And for the sake of comfort and coolness, instead of seating us in the house, he took us out on the side porch or veranda. A few minutes later, the Vice President arrived and greeted us very affable in his manner. He and Governor Phillips entered into considerable and detailed discussion of certain affairs pertaining to the national administration, in which I took no part, but merely an onlooker. My purpose had been achieved when I brought Mr. Phillips and the Vice President together. I do think that it was successful to a certain degree, in that it did serve to soften Phillips in some of his ideas concerning the national administration, although he never did become a believer in the so-called New Deal. Along about 11:30 or maybe a quarter, 12 o'clock, the Vice President broke off the discussion that he was engaged in with Mr. Phillips and said, "Gentlemen, when I am in Washington, I never take a drink until after 5 o'clock in the afternoon. When I am back home in the district, I do as I damn please. And right now, I damn well please to have a drink. Will you gentlemen join me?" Phillips, who had a deep-seated abhorrence for the use of alcoholic beverage in any form, acquiesced. And instead of calling a servant to serve the drinks, the Vice President got up and walked through the dining room out to another porch, and we followed him. On arrival at the back porch, he opened up the icebox or refrigerator and turned to Phillips and said, "Governor, what will you have?" And Phillips replied, I'll take a bottle of beer." The Vice President turned to me with what I thought to be somewhat of a note of despair in his voice, and said, "What do you have?" Well, I knew that Garner wanted to drink liquor. So, in an effort to bring about an understanding, I said, "Well, Mr. President, beer is a very nice pap for women and children, but it's no drink for a full-grown man. I'll just have a shot of liquor." And the Vice President, very much relieved, said, "I always did like a single-gutted man. I'll just have a drink of liquor right along with you."
When you were talking about the Vice President, the other day you talked about being in his office in Washington on one occasion in which Senator Clark was there.
Prior to this time, I had occasion to be in the office of the Vice President at Washington. He was on the floor of the Senate, or rather presiding over the Senate, and I was awaiting him to be at leisure. He came in, and I was told, I did not hear this conversation, but I was told that when he left the rostrum and started to walk out of the chamber, he passed the desk of Senator Bennett Clark from Missouri, and asked Bennett if he was particularly interested in what was going on, and Clark replied negative. Vice President said, "Well, let's go back to my office and strike a blow for liberty," to which Clark agreed. But in crossing over from the Senate chamber to the office of the Vice President, someone interrupted or attracted Clark's attention and gave him the conversation. The Vice President came on into his office, proceeded to have a drink, in which I joined him. And a few minutes later, Bennett came in. Clark said, Garner said, "Well, you know where the whiskey is. I'd be damned if I'm going to furnish you with whiskey and then get up and pour it for you." So Bennett went over to the little cupboard where the bottle was usually kept, opened it up, and here was a square cut glass decanter. Clark looked over at the Vice President and said, "What the hell's going on? Have you turned new deal or something of that sort?" Garner said, "No, but there's a story behind that. That when Jesse Jones was first appointed on a Reconstruction Finance Corporation Commission, he thought that he had quite a job, even though he was a minority member. And he decided to New York to contact some of his friends up there. And they more or less ignored him. After the boss, meaning President Roosevelt, appointed Jesse as chairman of the Corporation Commission, he went back up to New York and backtracked where he had been before. And of course they all fell over themselves to be nice to him, entertaining everything within their power. And among other things, they presented him with this decanter and filled with a very excellent grade of whiskey. That's the reason for it being here. He gave it to me after he got back to Washington. Clark said, "Well, that's a likely story. But I hope you're not fool enough to think that the whiskey in the decanter when Jesse gave it to you is the same high-grade brand of whiskey that they gave to Jesse." Vice President said, "No, I don't imagine that Jesse gave me the same whiskey that was given to him in New York. And by the same token, I hope you're not damn fool enough to think that the whiskey that's in there now is the same whiskey that's in there when Jesse gave it to me."
You I'm wondering if you may or may not have, but I'm wondering if you have any observation on the relationship between Vice President Garner and President Roosevelt, because the image that they each present to me is a very different kind of image.
I got the impression from my limited association with Vice President Garner that he was thoroughly loyal to President Roosevelt, even though he differed sharply with him in some of his political viewpoints. I never heard him criticize President Roosevelt. As a matter of fact, he always referred to him as the boss, and seemed to hold him in a high degree of personal affection, even though he might not agree with some of his political philosophies. I think that his refusal to become a candidate for vice president when Roosevelt ran for the third term arose more from Mr. Gardner's viewpoint of the question involved as to the expediency of setting a president for a third term, rather than any personal disagreement he had with President Roosevelt.
You, to drop back a little bit, you were Assistant Sergeant of Arms at the Democratic National Convention on one occasion, were you not?
I was in a Democratic convention that was held in St. Louis in 1916 when Woodrow Wilson was nominated for his second term.
You must have been an awful young man.
I was. I have never known why Murphy, who was a sergeant at arms from New York, offered me the appointment as assistant sergeant at arms. Undoubtedly, it came about through the request of one or more persons who were connected with or had a working relationship with Murphy, and probably wanted to see me get the appointment more by reason of the fact that they wanted to pay tribute to my father's political activities rather than mine. But I don't know. At any rate, I was tendered the appointment, and I did accept, and I did attend the convention.
You entered on your third military career, I guess, with World War II, or shortly before World War II.
Well, practically a continuation, because after I was relieved from active duty in 1919, I accepted a commission as in the United States Army Reserve. I went to the Infantry School of Arms at Fort Benning, Georgia in 1924 for what's known as the National Guard and Reserve Officers Course, only lasts 3 months. And in 1926, I went to the Command and Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, again for 3 months course of instruction. And upon the completion of that, Major General Markham, who then had command of the 45th Division, offered me a position on his staff as Division G3. I accepted that, and of course that carried with it the commission in the National Guard, which I retained until the National Guard was mobilized for World War II. At that time, I had been promoted to the grade of colonel and had command of the 179th Infantry. So when the 45th Division was called into active service, I again laid aside my civilian affairs and went in for the military affairs. continued on active duty until 1946.
While you were in the service, you were in charge, interestingly, of two prisoner of war camps. You told me.
Yes, in 1941 or 42, 1942, I was transferred from the 45th Division to headquarters 8th Army Corps, then situated in Dallas, Fort Sam Houston, Texas, and was then assigned to duty as commanding officer to a German prisoner of war camp at Roswell, New Mexico, which was just being completed. As a matter of fact, it was not altogether completed when I arrived there. And it was used as a prisoner of war camp for German prisoners of war. Later on, in 1945, I was transferred from Roswell, New Mexico to Alville, Loman, placed in command of the prisoner of war camp there, which was a more or less of a disciplinary camp. In other words, troublemakers from all over the United States were transferred to this camp at Alville.
Well, what was it like being in charge of a prisoner of war camp? It must have been considerably different between the two camps. If the second camp was the problem people.
The camp at Alva constituted a very more serious situation than the camp at Roswell, because of the fact that all of these men were hard-boiled, so to speak, and had been resentful of restrictions placed upon them as prisoners of war, and had used every opportunity possible to flout the authority, persons in authority over them. And for that reason, I soon found that I had to rule with a good deal sterner frame of mind than I had used at Roswell.
That's one thing I wanted to ask you. It's like being over a prisoner of war camp, especially the second camp, would require you being a very hard disciplinarian, hard man.
Required you to be very strict and very severe.
Was this hard on you, emotionally?
I just considered it another job that I had to do and perform it to the very best of my ability. When the prisoners of war at Roswell realized that there would be no temporizing, that certain rules and regulations were laid down for their government and observation and had to be lived up to, and if they didn't live up to it, it would bring about prompt punishment. From then on out, my problems were reduced by about 75%.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Was
The
there
Germans that I came in contact with, you did not necessarily have to use force with them. If they once became convinced that you had that force at your command, and if and when it became necessary to use it, you would use it, the battle was won.
You then were dismissed from the Army in 1946, and
Well, let's say I was relieved from active duty rather than dismissed.
yeah, that was a poor choice of words. And then today, as I interviewed you, you're serving in still another role in public service as a assistant district attorney for this county. I'm wondering, the fact that you've been in this role someday will be very significant historically, and it'll be significant to hear you reflect on this role. I'm wondering if you would reflect on the role, your role as a law.
Well, let's go back to the beginning of my holding my present position. When I was relieved from active duty in 1946, I came back to Purcell, Mrs. Gibbons and I, to make our home rather than to return to Oklahoma City for many reasons. Our two sons, who both had been in the Army, had married. I had some farm property here in McLean County which had been neglected during the 5 years that I had been absent in military service. Life was a little less strenuous in a smaller community than it was in Oklahoma City. Bear in mind the fact that I was born and raised in Purcell and had lots of friends in McLean County. Be it all of that as it may, we did come back to Purcell to live, and I attempted to establish a law practice here in Purcell. In 1960, the then county attorney, Mr. Rayburn, saw fit to resign, and the county commissioners offered me the position as a county attorney to fill out the unexpired term of Mr. Rayburn, which I accepted. But then no one would become a candidate for their office. So I served as a county attorney then without opposition, either in the primary or general election, until the legislature passed the district attorney bill, which abolished the office of county attorney. And Mr. Preston Trimble of Cleveland County was elected district attorney, and he offered me the position as assistant district attorney for McLean County, which I accepted. I'm here today.
What observations do you have on the role of a man in this position? Is it a difficult role? You're right in the middle of human crisis.
A law enforcement officer, particularly one who's charged with the responsibility and duty of prosecuting offenders, must of necessity be a difficult position, particularly in a small county like McLean County, where practically everybody knows everybody else, and any time a man lets his foot slip, why, he'll have a host of friends come to you and want you to give him special consideration or something of that sort. Now let me give you a concrete illustration of what I'm trying to say. When I first became county attorney in June of 1960, I hadn't been in office 30 days until a particularly good friend of mine called me up and said that a friend of his had been given a ticket by the highway patrol for a traffic violation, and he would like to have the case dismissed or nothing done about it. That's the first time I'd been confronted with that situation. I immediately realized that I was being faced with a rather crucial decision. If I made an exception in this man's favor, the next man who came along would have a friend or friends who wanted an exception made in his favor. And if I granted one and turned down the other one, and they said, well, you did so-and-so in such and such a case, and what's the difference between that case and my case? So I came to a fixed determination that there would be no fixing insofar as the county attorney's office is concerned. And I have adhered to that rule. And I think it has given the people of McLean County a greater respect for law enforcement than they have had in a long time. Certainly, I'm no longer approached by friends wanting me to give some transgressor of the law special consideration.
I'd like to ask you if you got an early, it seems to me that you must have gotten an early taste for politics and things from your father, and as a young man going to the national convention and so forth.
I guess I came about my love of political activity and governmental affairs largely due to the fact that my father was always intensely interested in governmental affairs. And I guess it goes further back than that because my maternal grandfather was interested in politics and governmental affairs.
Goes way back. That's interesting. You've had a life of involvement in so many different areas, in the military, House of Representatives, now as county attorney. It's interesting to trace it back that far. Well, it's been a very good interview. I appreciate your willingness to do that. Any final observations?
Well, I'm so sorry we were interrupted.